Welcome to another episode of So You Want to Read. Our genre of this week is science fiction and fantasy. Sci-fi and fantasy are sister genres, based on the question, what if? Science fiction is speculation on the natural world with imagined technology or advances in human knowledge, whereas fantasy is speculation involving alterations of the natural world. The genres are closely related and sometimes blend. Arguably, the main difference between the two genres are how the stories are packaged or how the settings feel to the reader. Fantasy offers transportation to alternate worlds. It appeals to readers who enjoy world building, where the author creates settings with their own history, lore, and rules. Fantasy can also be set in our own world with supernatural or whimsical elements introduced. When the story is set in an alternate universe, it is referred to as high fantasy, and when these elements intrude on our own otherwise normal world, it's called low fantasy. People have been sharing fantasy stories for millennia. Ancient mythology is filled with tales of heroes battling monsters, journeys to the underworld, and gods intervening in human affairs. Later came fairy tales such as the popular Brothers Grimm, which were the first low fantasy, imbuing our common landscapes with trolls, witches, fairy godmothers, and more. The 20th century saw the birth of modern fantasy, with the pulp stories of the 1930s and 40s. And this was followed by the story that is synonymous with fantasy today, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. If you're brand new to fantasy, try a classic, Swords and Deviltry by Fritz Leiber. Try a short and approachable book, Equal Rights by Terry Pratchett. Or a wild card, The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. Science fiction, even more so than fantasy, is based on the question, what if? What if faster-than-light travel were possible? What if robots could think and feel? What if we actually live in a computer simulation? Some stories are set in the far future or seem very outlandish. Some are set in a relatively modern time and seem much more plausible. The common thread is that the genre speculates on topics related to science and technology. Some stories are rigorously researched and deal with math, physics, computer science, and other existing fields of study. This is referred to as hard sci-fi because it deals with hard science. Other stories focus mainly on the human aspects or the social impacts of technology, and this is called soft sci-fi. It is commonly accepted that the first science fiction story was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818. There were additional pioneering works in the 19th century by Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. The term science fiction came into usage in the 1930s. 20th century science fiction trends tended to follow technological advances and changes in society's attitudes towards technology. Space opera is one of the biggest subgenres of science fiction that has been especially popular for decades and often includes a lot of elements of the fantasy genre. Star Wars is a good example of a space opera. If you're brand new to science fiction, try a classic, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, a shorter approachable, All Systems Red by Martha Wells, or a wild card, A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. Here's a tip, both sci-fi and fantasy tend to include a lot of series. If you aren't on board for a trilogy or even 6 or 7 books, look for a good standalone title.